Hi friends, I'm Rainy. This is Rainy Day Reads, and today I decided that I was going to do my Victober/October wrap up for you in kind of a casual style. Do you ever have those times, if you're a booktuber, where you know you need to film a video and you know that people would want to see said video, and you have time to film said video, but you just don't feel like filming said video? That was where I have been for the past few days. If you watch my channel, you've noticed that I put out a lot of videos in the last week, which was my intent. I'm thinking about doing Vlogmas, and I thought, well, maybe I'll try like a week and see if I can put out a video every day for a week and see how that goes and see if that seems like too overwhelming. So, I mean, I did it, but then after I was done with that and I had no more pre-filmed videos, I just kind of didn't want to make anymore. So, my solution to that is to just film on my couch a wrap up and just kind of chat. So, the first book that I read for October was not a Victober read. It was Carnations and Chaos by London Lovett. Now, if you have been following me for a while, you know that I have been slowly working my way through this cozy mystery series that I first heard about on Courtney at Cortagonist channel, and this was solely a cover buy for me at first because I just love all of the covers of this Port Danby series. But as I've been reading them, which, I mean, this is only the second one that I've read, but I'm really enjoying them. They are nice and short, and they are apparently independently published. So she's self-published, so everything is done on her own, which I fully support because I've done that, and it's hard work. and I didn't even do it, like, in the right way. She has a really fun style. Her protagonist, whose name is Pink, is really fun. She has a bionic nose, and kind of like a bloodhound, and she uses that nose to help solve crimes in the town of Port Danby. She has a flower shop, which, of course, as somebody with a bionic nose should have, of course. And yeah, just the characters in this are fun. She has a pet crow, which is unique, and I just really enjoy this series. This one follows an annual food fair that is put on in the town of Port Danby, and a prominent food blogger is killed. And of course, as most cozy mysteries go, the food blogger is not well liked by anyone who actually knows her. So, and there are plenty of people at this event who could be suspects in the crime. Book number 2 was my first Victober read of the month, and that was Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell. I have been wanting to read this for a very, very long time, and since I first started reading Elizabeth Gaskell, so this was my third Elizabeth Gaskell that I have read. And I used this for the prompt of a book that was under 250 pages. This did not disappoint me at all. It was just little vignettes about local rural life in the town of Cranford, and it follows quite a few women because women dominated this community, and it just goes through their lives and their backstories and their relationships with each other. It was a little bit of the whole parlor room gossip kind of thing, but it was done in a really sweet way where you knew that even if they gossiped, they had each other's backs the entire time. My favorite character in this was Miss Maddie, and probably the protagonist, Mary Smith, or not the protagonist, the narrator, Mary Smith. I just liked the perspective that her narration gave to the community, but I loved the story of Maddie Smith, or of Miss Maddie. Sorry. um, yeah, it was just very heartwarming. The whole story was heartwarming. It was funny. There were funny little vignettes that went on in this that were just hilarious. And I watched the miniseries that is based on this, the Cranford Chronicles, and just seeing some of those scenes on the screen made it even better. So I gave this 5 stars. The next book I read was also for Victober, and it is the book that dominated most of my month, and that is Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. And this I used for the prompt of a reread because I am very familiar with this story. I've read it at least once in high school or early college, and I was in the musical version, which is based off of it. It's not the complete story, but it actually followed fairly closely to the main points of this story. So I feel like that's if you want to dip your toes into Oliver Twist, but you don't want to read this chunker of a book, watch the musical. It'll give you the basic premise, and you'll get some music in there as well. but but yeah, this was a very good story. It had been forever since I'd actually read the book, so I'd forgotten a lot about it. I'd forgotten some of the additional characters, like Monk, who is actually a pretty central villain in this story. So I think, a lot of what I remembered was just the musical, because Monk is not involved in the musical at all. But Bill Sikes was as evil as ever, and Fagin, who is the leader of the band of criminal boys, pickpockets, he had a much deeper narrative in this book than he does, in the musical version, which is obvious. And his story towards the end was really heartbreaking, and I kind of felt bad for him, even though he was a criminal and a villain. I did kind of feel bad for him towards the end. I did not feel bad for Bill Sikes. He got what he got, and he deserved it. But I felt bad for Nancy, as you're supposed to. Nancy is one of my favorite Victorian characters. She is very nuanced and well-rounded, and you can't help but really feel for her and her predicament that she finds herself in throughout this whole story. But yeah, so this was a very nice reread for me. I enjoyed every moment of it, and I gave it 4 stars. The next story I read was also for Victober, and it was a short story written by Lewis Carroll of Adventures of Alice in Wonderland fame, and it was called Sylvie and Bruno. And this one I used for the challenge of an underrated work written in the year of my favorite Victorian work. But in the end, I realized that I think my dates were a little off, because I was going off of the date of The Importance of Being Earnest, which now I can't think of what it was off the top of my head. But Wikipedia, which is a font of knowledge, of course, told me that it was published in the same year that The Importance of Being Earnest was first performed. But then later I found different dates in the actual book. So I don't really think I completed this challenge. But nonetheless, I still read it and I enjoyed it. But I think it's not one that will stick with me. And it was very, it was Lewis Carroll, so it was very nonsensical at points. And it also delved into a lot of social issues of the time, which was interesting, but it kind of, I don't feel like it worked with the style of, there was kind of like 2 worlds, a fairyland and a fictionalized Victorian England. And I just think that the 2 didn't quite mesh together well. There was no reason for them to really be overlapping, and you just kind of, it started out where they overlapped nicely, but then they just kind of split off, and there was no real tie-in with them. So, yeah, in the end, I didn't really focus well on it, and it kind of was like okay, I read that. It was something else to read by Lewis Carroll that I didn't know existed, so I'm glad I read it. But ultimately, I gave it like 2.5 to 3 stars. The next book that I read was not for Victober, but it was for the Betsy Tacy 2019 read along, and that was Emily of Deep Valley. And I have a whole review on just this book where I gush about it, and I will link it below. But this was absolutely fantastic. It probably is one of my favorite of the Deep Valley series so far. I have some favorites of the actual Betsy Tacy portions of the books, but this was a standalone, and I think everybody that read it agreed that we would have loved to have seen a separate series that just focused on Emily. She was a very fascinating character, and it sounds like the girl that Emily is based off of was fascinating as well. So I fully gave this 5 stars. I probably would have given it more stars if that was an option, which I guess it is, because I mean, I could give it 10 stars if I wanted to. But five stars. Another book that I read for Victober was part of the Knit and Listen that some women and maybe some men, I don't know, I only knew of some women, but participated in during the whole month of October. And we read Adam Bede by George Eliot. And I really enjoyed it in the end. It took a very long time to get started, which I feel is kind of like an MO for George Eliot. Some of her work takes a little while to really sink into my mind. But the whole, like, probably 2/3 of the book was just more of like slices of life and getting to know the characters of Adam Bede and his family, and Hetty and her family, and some other people in the village where they lived. And then, out of the blue, seemingly, in the probably last third of the book, it really took a turn, and it was jarring, but I do think that it worked for the overall plot of the book. And yeah, just really dramatic things happened, and you were like on pins and needles for the rest of the book, trying, to get to what happens to some of the characters. And in a lot of respects, it turns out sort of well for some of them. In other respects, pretty badly. And I think, it does end on I don't know if I would call it a hopeful note, but it ends well. Overall, I thought this ended up being a really good story. I'm glad I stuck with it through kind of the slog at the beginning. And George Eliot's writing is very beautiful. It just is very descriptive, so if that's not your cup of tea, you'll probably have a hard time getting through it. But if you can make it through the 2/3 of the book, you're going to be rewarded with a pretty good plot towards the end. So I ended up giving this 3.5 to 4 stars. And the last thing I read for my original TBR for Victober was A Woman of No Importance by Oscar Wilde. I have read this play before. I have seen it performed locally, and I just love it. I love everything that Oscar Wilde writes, and especially his plays, and the social commentary in this was very interesting. The view of women and of sin and of forgiveness, and basically forgiving yourself and letting yourself heal from your past mistakes and not giving in to what society believes that you should do was very interesting and very well done in this play. The comedy was there, definitely, and it was very Oscar Wilde to for people that like such plays as The Importance of Being Earnest. It was definitely there. It was definitely parlor room comedy, but the overall plot of this play was very deep, very emotional, and very probably very socially controversial for that time period. So I really enjoyed it, and it was funny because the whole time I was reading the play, I was picturing the friends that I had that had done this play in the past that I'd seen perform it, and so it just gave it like a little added reminiscence to and nostalgia to my reading, and I was hearing their voices as I was reading it. So yeah, it was lovely. Now, towards the end of October, I wanted to participate in Elaine Hallen's Halloween soiree, which I did a reading vlog for that I will link below. But I was kind of out of Victorian novels by that point. I had finished early, surprisingly. Um, so I picked a couple of reads that that I finished two. I did not finish one, but I went with Goblin Market by Christina Rossetti, which I also had read in high school and hadn't read since. So I read that, and it was very nostalgic and lovely. I'm not a big poetry fan, but I like the style of poetry that tells a story, and I like the longer poetry that is more narrative and tells an interesting story, kind of like Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven and such things like that. So I really enjoyed this play. I remembered how much I like Christina Rossetti, and I'm going to go back and read more by her. The other thing that I read that was not for the soiree was Diary of a Nobody by George Grossman. And I had heard Kate Howe talk about this, and she recommended it to me as something very short to read. It only took me less than a day to read it, and it was so funny. It was probably one of my favorite Victorian reads from this month. And I didn't even originally have it on my TBR. And it was just so funny and just endearing, and the main character in it was just like a funny little old man, and it was fun to watch his musings about his wife and his son. That seems like kind of somebody that it's kind of like having a liberal child when you are a staunch conservative. That's kind of the way that went down. So it was funny to see, and yeah, it was just really delightful, and I was glad to read that at the tail end of October. And then lastly, let's talk about the things that I DNF'd. I first DNF'd Miss Marchbanks by Margaret Oliphant. And I don't know if I was just starting to get burned out because I kind of read it towards the end of October, but it just kind of seemed like nothing ever happened in this book. It was billed as a Victorian Emma, like Jane Austen's Emma, and I can see the comparison. The main character of Lucilla Marchbanks was very much an Emma-esque character. She was a well-to-do girl whose mother had died, and she was coming back to take care of her father, and she was very much against getting married because she just knew she wanted to look after her father, and that was her lot in life. But of course, there were men involved with her, and there was a girl who was a little lesser on the social scale than Lucilla, that she was trying to set up with somebody. So, I mean, you can see the Emma comparisons. But where it differed was that I did not feel that Lucilla was as likable as Emma. I feel that Emma is likable and that she is just kind of clueless about, to use the adaptation that goes along with Emma, but she's just kind of clueless about what she's doing to people. But I didn't feel like Lucilla was that way. I felt like Lucilla was a little bit more calculating and just not very nice. Like I don't know. I just felt like she was um, very vain and very like just selfish. Even though she was saying that her life goal was to take care of her father, she just came across as like, oh, look at me doing this wonderful thing for my dad, and I just didn't like that, and then it just went on and on and on, and nothing really ever came of anything, and I just kind of got bored, so I put it away. And the last thing that I tried to read in October, but ultimately DNF'd, was Dracula by Bram Stoker. And I didn't think that I was going to like this. I'm not into Halloween. I'm not into scary stuff. But I wanted to read it for Elaine's Halloween soiree. And I did get about halfway through. And at the beginning of the novel, I thought, oh, this is going to be really interesting. I did kind of like the spooky vibes of Dracula's castle and the main character when he was at the castle and he was trying to kind of figure out who Dracula was, and when he finally realized what was happening. But then it cut back to Mina, his girlfriend, something like that, his fiance, and her life and what was happening there, and I just got bored at that point. And they weren't going back to the actual action of Dracula, and I'm sure they would have gotten there eventually, but they wasted a lot of time in Mina's life, and I just didn't really care. She wasn't that interesting of a character, and the people she was around weren't that interesting, and I got bored, and I knew I wasn't going to finish it on Halloween, and I just decided I didn't want to continue it into November. So maybe next Halloween I'll try again. That was kind of long, but I hope that you enjoyed my wrap up for October and for October in general. And yeah, I just absolutely love October. This is one of my favorite months of the year. And in thinking about next year and what month-long read-alongs I do want to participate in, October is not even an option of getting rid of it. Like, it's going to be there. In fact, I'm going to try to make an entire year of at least reading one Victorian novel every couple of months up until October. Because I just feel like I'm still kind of a newbie when it comes to Victorian literature, even though I feel like I've probably read a lot of Victorian literature, back in the day. I just feel like in my in my adult years, I'm not quite as versed as I feel like I should be. So I want to go into next year's October having a little bit more under my belt, so I can put out some more specialized content next year. That's the plan. We'll see if it works. I hope you all had a lovely Victober. I've enjoyed watching a lot of other people's wrap ups, and I look forward to next year already. So, on to Nonfiction November. Bye, friends.